webinar's not actually started yet, so no one is on.
Okay, and I'm going to get introduced.
Exactly.
Okay, so I'll just stand here. We're about a minute to showtime if we're going to be on time.
Yeah, I think Sarah's going to come up and introduce you. I think that's what she wanted
Okay.
us. Yeah. And we'll probably start right on time. But like I said, for webinars will be this over 24 people so far. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Stand here.
Just a moment.
Oh,
All right, Mark will give me the signal when he's let the folks in on Zoom. All right. All right. All right, welcome everyone. My name is Sarah Alger. I'm the director of the Russell Museum here at Mass General. Welcome to the folks in the room, many of whom I recognize from previous lectures, and to folks on Zoom. Thank you to those of you who filled out our lecture survey. We're taking a look at the results and we'll share any interesting findings in an upcoming newsletter. So thank you for taking the time. As our frequent lecture goers know, we take July and August off, but stay tuned for our fall programming, which we'll also announce in our newsletter. Just one housekeeping note for the Zoomers. Just use the Q&A function to ask questions at the end of Dr. Forman's presentation. And with that, I'm so pleased to welcome Dr. Forman back to the Russell Museum after a decade. He talked about the same topic at that time, and we're so glad to see him back. He is a visiting scientist in the Department of Environmental Health at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and an historian. He is the author of Dr. Joseph Warren, The Boston Tea Party, Bunker Hill, and the Birth of American Liberty, which is newly reprinted in a deluxe edition for the 250th anniversary that we all know about. He's also the author of Ill-Fated Frontier, Peril and Possibilities in the Early American West. And with that, let's welcome Dr. Forman.
So I'm Dr. Forman, but we're going to talk about the doctor's warrant. So I'm going to speak about Revolutionary era Warrens, particular members of the Warren family, who were very influential in the founding of Massachusetts General Hospital. And I'm going to recall some of the exploits of these Warrens and how they actually inspired the founders or co-founders of this institution. So I'm going to be talking a lot about American history of the Revolutionary War prior to the founding of Mass General in 1811. But I think you will see that there are some pretty hard linkages amongst them through this impressive family lineage. So as an overview, we're going to focus on Dr. Joseph Warren, a physician who passed away before his time in 1775, and we'll talk a lot about that. And Warren's vision for America's future, not only politics, for which he is best known to the extent that he is known, but also his influence in healthcare and medicine, which is much less known and is felt through this institution. Warren grew up in Roxbury, which was then an independent market town just south of Boston. The Warren homestead had been there for a couple of generations. Joseph Warren was actually Joseph Warren III, the first sometimes called the Mariner in the Warren genealogies, came over in the 1660s and settled in Boston initially and then got some land in Roxbury. They had a diversified farm there with orchards and some wheat and milk cows, and basically were a thriving little yeoman family. Joseph Warren was the eldest of four sons, and he was born in 1741. The Warren or Roxbury russet apple is associated with the Warren family. It's the first practical commercial apple variety in the United States. They had adapted it from European stock, probably through England, and it was already established in Roxbury at the time of the Warrens' childhood. I'll mention it just for those who may have some enthusiasm for apples and apple cider as to why it was such an innovation. It doesn't look like much. It's russet. I mean, it has a bumpy surface, looks like the surface of a potato from Maine or something, and it's not real red, and it's not the kind of eating apple that you would just pick up and, you know, crunch for a snack. However, it had very high sugar content and ripened late in the fall. So you could pick it late in October at first frost, and it would easily last in a cellar over the winter without refrigeration. And then if you would make it into cider, you can easily make a cider with 9% alcohol, 18 proof. And for those who frequent the Warren Tavern and other places where you find alcoholic beverages, modern apple ciders would be considered quite wussy by comparison. High sugar content. Also, the apples, some of you may know, are predominantly propagated by cuttings. They have 17 chromosomes, which is an odd number. So if you have a great apple variety that you want to propagate, like the Warren family ancestors did, you would take cuttings and plant them. A cutting is a clone. It's not from seeds. So if you find Roxbury russet apples or Warren russet apples in the farmer's market in the fall, I would suggest that you take a bite of them, and you will not only be approximating what Joseph Warren tasted and his brothers and his family, but for all practical purposes, it's exactly what they would have eaten. It's a clone of it. Okay, let me just go back of the harvest of 1755 was an important one and a sad one in the Warren family. Joseph Warren's father was involved in the late October harvest of the apples. He went out on a limb, quite literally, lost his footing, fell down, and broke his neck. It's recorded that he lived for a short time as his youngest son, who wasn't quite 3 years old, attended to his dad in his expiring moments. What a sad scene. That son was John Warren, who we will talk about later. So Joseph Warren grew up on this farm. He would take milk from the family cow and hawk it in Boston. Later on, political enemies would make fun of him as a bare-legged milk boy, but he was probably very proud of it, as were hardworking folks of his social class. He was able to go to Harvard. He was an orphan at that point, but his mother mortgaged the farm so that he could go to Harvard. He started when he was 14 years old, which wasn't all that unusual at the time. He graduated in class 1759, and a couple of years later, after teaching school in Roxbury Latin for a year or two, joined St. Andrew's Lodge of Masons, and more importantly, apprenticed to the most prominent physician in Boston at the time, Dr. James Lloyd. Now, there were three ways that you could be a physician in those days in Boston. Do you all know the three? Well, I'll tell you. So one way is you could go to medical school. However, there are no medical schools in Boston. There's one medical school in Philadelphia that had only been around for a couple of years. So going to medical school meant you would have to prevail upon your parents to send you to Europe to study in London, Scotland, Leiden, and study in hospitals in Europe. That was the most prestigious thing to do. Obviously, you'd have to be of a certain social class for your parents to send you over there to live and to pay the tuition. So that was pretty unusual to have doctors with that background, but that is exactly the background that Dr. Lloyd had when he went to London in the 1750s. The second way is you would apprentice yourself to a successful physician who had that background. And you would be an apprentice for 2 years to that physician, and you would learn from him. They were all he's in that time. That was Joseph Warren's trajectory with Dr. Lloyd. And the third way was to put out a shingle saying, I'm a physician. And if all libertarians take note, if the patients come and they're satisfied, well, that's the proof of it. Self-appointed physician. There were a lot of issues in these generations about the apprentice trained and the medical school trained calling the self-appointed physicians quacks, but a number of them did achieve some degree of competency and a following. Dr. Thomas Young, who is probably better known as a fellow son of liberty for his political activism and was a colleague of Joseph Warren, was one of these self-appointed physicians. I think he was the person who named the state of Vermont. I became interested in Joseph Warren as being trained as an historian, as an undergraduate back in the day. And one of the reasons why writing Warren's biography has been difficult is, unlike a number of the founding figures, he was not a diarist. He did not write a prolific number of letters that have survived. And in fact, the most frequent or most voluminous records that he kept in his own hand were the records of his medical practice through his account books, which are in a Latin abbreviation, so opaque that most folks can't make heads or tails out of them. Contents are in Latin abbreviations for a kind of medical practice which is obsolete, I would say. However, I could make sense out of it, and that was a way of looking at Joseph Warren's world, like looking through a keyhole of a medical office from the 1760s and 70s. So I had some success in doing that. I reconstructed the account books, those that were missing, through some rules of forensic accounting, and was able to reconstruct his professional life. And through the people he dealt with, many of whom did leave written records, was able to reconstruct his professional and a lot of his personal life. So he began private practice in the north end of Boston in 1763, just on the eve of, or immediately before the Stamp Act crisis and international disagreements between imperial England and its relationship with its colonies. And if you had to pick a place for a medical practice that would come to be a scene of political agitation, that was it. He did not do this deliberately. It just happened that way. One of his first challenges as a young physician building a practice was that there was a smallpox epidemic in Boston in 1764. And he played a key role in a major inoculation campaign to prevent people from catching wild smallpox. Now, this isn't immunization like those who know something about health history, about Dr. Jenner in England immunizing people with cowpox. No, this is inoculation with live smallpox. You have smallpox, I would take a pock, take the pus, and take you and scratch your arm and give you smallpox. And it was known empirically, and this was an import actually from the Ottoman Empire and from other places, that empirically noted that if you caught smallpox through this deliberate inoculation and had very aggressive supportive care in an ad hoc smallpox hospital, that it was much less deadly by a factor of 10 to 20. No germ theory, no virus theory, just empiricism that controlled smallpox was a whole lot better to have than the wild kind. He became an op-ed writer for newspapers in this time frame, writing under pseudonyms, some of which were advocating more disciplined practice of medicine as philophysic, lover of medicine, and others on political topics that had to do with the Sons of Liberty and regional rights under the British Constitution. He also got married during this time. Here's some data that was collected. This is in an era where of no public health departments whatsoever. These are physicians acting privately and collectively, voluntarily, to inoculate people against smallpox, treat them in temporary hospitals, and send them back to the community. And with cooperation with newspapers and churches, they were able to track the mortality of those people inoculated versus those who were not. You'll see the 1764 data. The vast majority of uninoculated people in Boston under this regimen were inoculated with a mortality rate of under 1%, whereas the people who caught smallpox wild died 20 times higher rate. Joseph Warren was an in-house doctor at one of these temporary smallpox hospitals, and there he met people of all social classes who were not his patients ordinarily, but they were there in the smallpox hospital to have controlled smallpox. And miraculously, nobody under his care passed away. Within a couple of years, he met up with some friends through his connections. He was apparently a very gregarious person who socially went in and out of a number of different groups of folks. And he became a political activist in the Sons of Liberty. He was probably recruited by a publisher to be one of these op-ed writers and became a political protege of the radical Son of Liberty, Samuel Adams, by the mid to late 1760s. I'm skipping ahead a little bit in history by the Boston Massacre of 1770, as tensions with the British overseers of Massachusetts as a colony escalated over a period of time. There was a riot, which we know as the Boston Massacre, that occurred in March of 1770. Warren was not on the scene, but he was involved. He did an autopsy on one of the boys who was killed there. But he also wrote and spoke about it through these annual commemorations of called the Boston Massacre orations. And he and his colleagues not only use the commemoration of the massacre as a means of keeping interest in asserting regional autonomy under the British Constitution, but also of a platform of seeing the struggle in greater terms of natural rights, of the rights of citizens to be represented, limitations on executive power, things that were commonly recognized, if controversial, in England itself. Warren and his colleagues were asserting these kinds of rights for citizens in the province of Massachusetts. So that put them at odds for our colonial British overseers. There's some quotes from the 72 oration. So Joseph Warren was bombastic. He had a great facility of turns of words that were not empty, of seeing the issues at hand for not only what they were, but to project a responsibility in his hearers or in his listeners that they had some obligation to take a stand and to right these wrongs. And he was quite effective at doing that. Things came to a head in what had become known to the Boston Tea Party. Joseph Warren played a key role in the Boston Tea Party. In my book, I speculate what that was. However, it's the, how would you say, the footprints were covered quite aggressively. He was the Grand Master of the St. Andrew's Lodge at that point, and we do know that many of the folks who tossed the tea into the harbor were members of the St. Andrew's Lodge, but the St. Andrew's Lodge had no official relationship to that activity. And Joseph Warren, during the meetings at Old South that led up to the Tea Party, is not recorded as having spoken, although he was on the podium and was a very effective speaker, already known to be. So I speculate that he may have been like a stage manager of the Tea Party, organizing or coordinating the folks who did toss the tea over with the speakers on the podium in an age before cell phones or instant communications. It's purely speculation. He was involved in a committee of correspondence, was one of the founding members of that, to solicit conversations with like-minded sons of liberty and daughters of liberty up and down the East Coast and in other provinces. After the Tea Parties, some of the Sons of Liberty may have hoped that the British government would have backed down like they did after the stamp riots in 1765. But rather than doing that, the British government doubled down and passed a number of acts called the Coercive Acts that basically shut down the port of Boston, took away elected members of government in favor of ones appointed by the royally appointed governor. The royal appointed governor became the general of British forces in North America, General Gage, who moved up from New York with soldiers to Boston. Suffolk resolved, Suffolk County, which included Boston, was an epicenter of this disagreement, constitutional crisis, you might describe it, between the colonists and the colonial overseers as to how they would react. At this time, the First Continental Congress was organizing in Philadelphia in the late summer, and some of the leading patriots that we know of, like Samuel Adams, people like that, were going to Philadelphia to represent Massachusetts, which was on point of this crisis, at the Continental Congress, and it was hoped that intercolonial coordination opposing the British policies would come out of Philadelphia. But how Boston was going to react was all important. And Joseph Warren was the ranking son of liberty left in Boston as the Continental Congress was being organized. So he was responsible as an elected representative of the town of Boston, his first elective office, to go with other elected representatives of the towns in Suffolk County, which at that time included Boston, to resolve how they were going to oppose the British. And that has become the Suffolk Resolves. You could read a couple of the sentences, the bombastic way he has of writing and talking to scope these issues in a bigger frame. Whereas the power but not the justice, the vengeance but not the wisdom of Great Britain, which of old persecuted, scourged, and exiled our fugitive parents from their native shores, now pursues us, their guiltless children, with unrelenting severity. And it goes on. He's talking about resistance to the coercive acts, but there is an existing rough draft of the Suffolk Resolves that Joseph Warren did not write, and it is just flat by comparison. I mean, it's the same topics. It's how the Massachusetts is proposing to have very aggressive boycotts and to shun people who would buy British imported goods, and a number of other action steps, but it's not framed in this colorful, action-oriented kind of manner. See the difference. Joseph Warren touch. On the fortitude, on the wisdom, and on the exertions of this important day is suspended the fate of this new world. The day that this was passed, around September the 6th, 1774, Joseph Warren called in the regular writer of dispatches for the Sons of Liberty, Paul Revere, and sent him on his longest ride to Philadelphia express to present this to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. They were just getting organized. And when this landed on it, they were so impressed that they passed the Suffolk Resolves word for word as a resolve of the First Continental Congress. So in that sense, the Suffolk Resolves are a kind of a founding document of the country. So it gave focus to the First Continental Congress at a very critical juncture. Dramatic presentation by Paul Revere, and adopted unanimously. Joseph Warren himself, in my biography, I never had tracked him as traveling more than 75 miles from Boston in his entire life. So he had quite the impact around the country and was quite well known through writings and publications of the massacre orations and ultimately his actions. 1775 annual oration was especially impactful in that the British had reoccupied Boston. They pulled out after the Boston Massacre for a while, but then they came back in the fallout of the coercive acts to punish Boston after the Tea Party. And so this oration was fraught. There were British soldiers in the audience. Samuel Adams, who was a key leading patriot, decided to invite the British officers to keep an eye on them and reserve the first few rows for Warren's speech. It was fraught there were rumors flying around, credible rumors, that if Warren said anything that would be considered treasonous, the British soldiers were prepared to arrest him on the spot or kill him, run him through. There's all kinds of wild rumors flying around. And considering the British Army was sort of like itching for a fight at this point, pretty believable. In fact, at one point, the idea was to give Warren the out, like not to give this speech, and he would have none of it. He had such an audience. They say there was as many as 6,000 people at Old South. And of course, Old South does not hold 6,000 people. So there were people outside on sidewalks. When he arrived late, he saw some patients that morning. He's still an active physician. And he arrived about as much as an hour late. So when he got there, the audience was kind of fidgety and packed, and he could not get into Old South. So he had to climb up a ladder on a window behind the podium in order to get in. He's also quite a showman. You notice in this modern depiction, there are no period engravings from the speech. He's wearing a toga. To my knowledge, is the only major American speech in history where someone was like dressed up in costume, but it was not a random thing. He was putting forth on behalf of Massachusetts and the Sons of Liberty what they described as Roman Republican virtues in opposing an arbitrary Caesar-like dictator and dictates coming from Parliament being hostile to American interests. So it was no joke, but he's projecting America in the clothing, literally, of Roman Republican virtue. Here's some of the words from that oration. The tools of power in every age have racked their inventions to justify the few in sporting with the happiness of the many, and having found their sophistry too weak to hold mankind in bondage, have impiously dared to force religion, the daughter of the King of Heaven, to become a prostitute in the service of hell. Doesn't pull any punches. And then it goes on to have a sarcastic view of colonialism, slaughtering pagan countries and taking them over, somehow in the twisted name of Jesus. You can imagine what the British soldiers were thinking when they were hearing this. Memorable phrases drop like water from Joseph Warren's speeches. Our country is in danger, but not to be despaired of. Our enemies are numerous and powerful, but we have many friends determined to be free, and heaven and earth will aid the resolution. On you depend the fortunes of America. You are to decide the important questions on which rests the happiness and liberty of millions yet unborn. Act worthy of yourselves. Words to inspire in 1775, words that still ring true. It was as if he was speaking not only to his audience, but to a future vision of what America could be. Now, Joseph Warren was still seeing patients at that time. His office is like 3 blocks from British Army headquarters, and the British Army seemed to be getting ready for a fight. So Joseph Warren apparently was heading up what we might call a spy ring, but just keeping an eye on the British as to what their intentions were and whether there'd be any military movements. He probably didn't think of it as a spy ring because he lived there an entire life, and these British soldiers were occupiers and interlopers who had no business in Boston, I'm sure, as far as he was concerned. So some of his patients, and this is his account book, and you keep in mind the purpose of an account book is to keep track of medical interactions and the billings attached to it. It's ultimately a financial document. So, you know, if you have some expectation of collecting your fees from these people, you might want to identify them by name so you can track them down and they could pay their bills. It's not like there's any insurance around, you know, unheard of in this time frame. So there are patients like the Indian, Zipporah, a Negro woman, Mr. Cattern. Mr. Cattern got my eye because Mr. Cattern apparently didn't have medical care, but Joseph Warren was paying him halfpence coins, 20 shillings worth, which is like 100 of them. And a halfpence coin was a copper coin about the size of a quarter now, probably heavier. Like, why was Joseph Warren paying small amounts of money to someone going through his practice? I have no idea. Could not identify Mr. Cattern. But these are suspicious. Cook, soldier's wife. What soldiers are in Boston? Joseph Warren's patients include people associated with the occupying British Army. A soldier's child, camp woman. So were these people part of Joseph Warren's network? Maybe not even formally, just hit them up for what are you seeing? What did you see today? Or what is your unit doing that you're associated with? We'll never know. However, we do know on the evening of April the 18th, 1775, just a hair over 250 years ago, Joseph Warren, in his position as president pro tem of the Provincial Congress, called in Paul Revere and William Dawes into his medical office and set them on the iconic ride. What he was doing was activating the militia. And he had the power to do that. Effectively, he was the governor of Massachusetts, with all the leading patriots in Philadelphia are on their way towards the Second Continental Congress. There's also a parallel communication. This is communicating to the militias west of the city that the British were apparently on their way towards Lexington and Concord to seize militia stores that the Provincial Congress was stockpiling just in case things got out of hand. Paul Revere set up a lantern system, one by land, two by sea, as a duplicative way of getting the word from downtown Boston out to towns west of Boston. So he got through himself, so did Dawes. But there was also a lantern system in parallel. So Joseph Warren, in essence, pulled the trigger on the Revolutionary War. This is a proximate act in the chain that started the Revolutionary War, activating the militia. So when the British did go out, there were confrontations in Lexington and Concord, and they got out of hand, and hence the war. Joseph Warren's home was on Hanover Street, and you would think that this would be quite the shrine on the Freedom Trail, but it's not, because it was torn down in 1840. Let's advance this slide. Okay, there is a story about how did Joseph Warren know so exactly what the British were up to? And the story is kind of like a romance. I deal with it in the book, but it's almost certainly not true. Is that Joseph Warren was having an affair with the British general's wife, Margaret Kemble Gage. You know, it makes for a nice story, but it's not true. She was 17 years younger than the general. The general was a lot more interested in the minutiae of running the British Army than with her. She was American born. She was a Tory. So she was under suspicion even in that time frame as being what we might call a rat. But she wasn't. And some historians have speculated on her role. For those who are interested in that kind of thing, I can tell you afterwards the arguments why she was the source of Joseph Warren's information, and then the reality of why she wasn't. All circumstantial, of course. Location of Warren's home is buried under City Hall Plaza. This is a bird's eye view of City Hall Plaza prior to the renovations. That X is the approximate location of Joseph Warren's house, which was leveled probably in the 1840s. It was last known of as being on the grounds of an American House Hotel, which was a major hotel in Scully Square, long gone. So there is no way of knowing that that's where Joseph Warren's house was, on or near the X. Okay, so Joseph Warren, could you help me advance the pictures? So Joseph Warren not only activated the militia, but he actually participated. He snuck out of Boston himself, joined the fighting during the British retreat in West Cambridge, now Arlington. And he not only is recorded as joining the fighting, and of course he didn't have much military experience, or none at that point, but he was right out there. You know, he's advocating resistance to the British, not military up until this moment, but he wasn't afraid to join the fight. And he was also attending the wounded, which is traditionally a separate role, you know, the medics in the field and the leaders. But with him, it was sort of same. While he was out there, he had a stylish roll of his hair. He was near the front lines, and a musket ball took off that lock of hair. That's a pretty close call. Didn't miss a beat. Just keeps on doing his thing. He also, in his interlocking roles as provincial Congress president, head of the Committee of Safety in charge of the Minutemen and the militia, Committee of Donations, was sort of the glue that kept the siege of Boston together during the first couple of months. He was like everywhere at once, it seemed. A previous biographer called this the 100 days of Joseph Warren, the time from the massacre oration to 1775 to his passing in June. He made sure that there were depositions taken right after the Battle of Lexington and Concord of what happened there. He made sure, and he probably wrote the account of the British fighting in Lexington Concord, hired a boat, made sure that got to England 2 weeks before the official dispatches. He was also involved in negotiating people coming in and out of occupied Boston, prisoner exchange, all during these 2 months. He was also advocating forcefully something that the Massachusetts delegation at the Continental Congress already wanted, and that was that now that the fighting has started, to appoint a continental army to oppose the British, rather than this New England hodgepodge army of observation, which was the mobilized forces after the Battle of Lexington and Concord. So this is the first couple of months of the siege of Boston. Effectively, he's in charge. So here's some of the actions that he did. Some of the things he did, he never saw the end of, but he teed up. The Committee of Safety, he appointed folks to go up to Ticonderoga. Wasn't his idea, but he made sure that they had enough money to do this, to check out the cannons there and to bring them back to Boston. So the getting of the cannons from Fort Ticonderoga was done under the leadership of Joseph Warren and the Committee of Safety back in end of May of 1775. For all this, he was interested in advancing the quality of medicine in the province. In May, in the effort to regularize these activated militia forces into a New England army, amongst other things, appointing officers and enlisted men be formally recruited into regiments. You also set up a system of regimental surgeons. And he personally quizzed surgeon applicants for these appointments. So he wouldn't let just anybody be the clinical care for this emerging army. And there's an account, the Dr. Belknap, who later became an historian, of him being quizzed by Joseph Warren during one of these interviews and how terrifying it was. So what he was doing was he had the best in mind for the soldiers who were now had been activated and were putting their lives on the line. He wanted the best care for them. But he also, I think, had in mind a future where there were standards for medicine and you had to prove yourself. Earlier, one of his false starts was to start a Massachusetts Medical Society in the 1760s. Never got off the ground. So this may have been a step in that direction. One of those people was his own younger brother who idolized him, John Warren. We last tuned in as a 2.5-year-old attending to his dad in his final moments. He was a medical apprentice to Joseph Warren, idolized him, but he was also quizzed by his older brother before he could become a regimental surgeon. Joseph Warren at that point, even though he was an advocate for forceful resistance, I think ultimately he wanted a peaceful solution. You know, the best defense is a good offense and not be a pushover. But I think it became apparent by the time the fighting and the siege of Boston occurred that this situation was going to be decided militarily. So he, through his connections at the provincial Congress, he's already president of it, makes it known that he wants to be appointed a major general. This is like June the 14th, 1775. A fighting major general, not the surgeon general. He wants to be a fighting general. And he was so charismatic and I guess was a bit heroic there, even in Arlington in April, in that skirmish there, that they elected him Major General over people who had military experience in the French and Indian War. Now, there weren't a lot of people like that, but there were some of them, and they were militia officers. So he was appointed Major General. Major General is like above the other generals of the Massachusetts provincial forces. So the Battle of Bunker Hill very rapidly developed. There was intelligence that the Americans had that the British were going to fortify Dorchester Heights. So the Americans quickly decided in their Committee of Safety that they would preemptively fortify Bunker Hill. There's a lot of confusion. on that day when they sent troops out, this is which one's Bunker Hill, Breeds Hill is closer. Let's do it on Breeds Hill. So there's a lot of improvisation going on there, which confused things greatly. Joseph Warren came to the battlefield after the battle had started. Apparently, he suffered from what we would call cluster headaches or migraines that would disable him sometimes. So it was not considered surprising he had one of those things on the morning of the Battle of Bunker Hill and actually showed up late. So he encounters on Bunker Hill, which is about a half-mile back of the most forward fortifications on Breeds Hill, he encounters General Putnam from Connecticut, who is a militia general. So this is a 19th century engraving. During these times, nobody had uniforms, actually. So Putnam says, I hear that you've been appointed Major General, Warren. What are my orders? So Warren would have been the ranking officer in charge during the Battle of Bunker Hill. So words were exchanged. The way historians at the time say it, it sounds very orderly, where Warren says that he was not confirmed in his appointment as Major General. Therefore, he's there to fight as a common soldier. Where is the fighting be the hottest? And Putnam directs him forward to the redoubt. Has the same conversation with the colonel in the redoubt. He shows up. Warren, what are my orders? I have no orders. I'm here to fight as a common soldier. So that he does. This picture is an icon of all history books. It is the Battle of Bunker Hill. The original title of it is The Death of Major General Joseph Warren at the Battle of Bunker's Hill, June 17, 1775. Unfortunately, the central figure is Joseph Warren, who was killed in the last minutes of the battle. There are at least 12 wildly different accounts of Joseph Warren's last moments of the Battle of Bunker Hill. Some of them have him give patriotic speeches that go on for pages and pages, and others have him shot randomly at the end and fall down. There was mass confusion at the time. The Americans had run out of ammunition. They were retreating. There was black powder smoke everywhere, deafening noise. The British were over the parapet. Joseph Warren's nephew, John Collins Warren, had his body exhumed 75 years later and took pictures of Joseph Warren's skull. The lower left is an inset of that. This allowed me as a biographer to sort through the wildly different accounts. These pictures are some of the earliest forensic pictures taken anywhere in the world. I did an animation reconstruction of them for the purpose of determining what kind of bullet Joseph Warren suffered, and that might tell us something. So you notice the maxilla, which is the jawbone, has a hole in it, and you could see air out the other side. That is not natural. That is an entrance wound. I was able to, and the false teeth were made by Paul Revere. Those are Paul Revere's dental instruments, which are in a medical museum in Washington, D.C. So I was able to put a scale into the picture by comparison with orbital diameter, which doesn't change much for Northern European adult men. That was a 54 caliber projectile. British Army muskets were standardized as 75 caliber. This is considerably smaller. British officers outfitted their own pistols and light muskets called fusees. All surviving specimens of those are 60 caliber or less. This was a British officer's weapon. that is the fatal wound of Joseph Warren. One of the accounts, as Joseph Warren recognized on the battlefield as he's opposing several British regulars, and an officer attempts to take him prisoner. The officer's assistant, a Batman, is said to have grabbed the officer's weapon and shot Joseph Warren down. And then that soldier himself was shot down in the confusion. That, I believe, is the most credible account consistent with the forensic evidence. There's also things like Joseph Warren had his head chopped off and really strange and macabre things. This skull does not show any evidence of that kind of nefarious activity. John Warren stayed on as Continental Army surgeon. He realized his helping aspirations, which may have dated back to not being able to help his dad in his dad's dying moments, founder of Harvard Medical School, president of Mass Medical Society, and a major Mason. John Collins Warren, though he never met Joseph Warren, was an advocate of the legacy, took it to heart, had expressions like, in sickness, we are all brothers, which is a founding motto of Mass General Hospital. And there are some of the achievements of John Collins Warren. First, a key person, co-founder of Mass General Hospital. These are said to be the last words of Joseph Warren the night before the battle. It's a Latin quote. It's sweet and proper to die for one's country. There is current interest in Joseph Warren, surprisingly. There's an off-Broadway show opening this week about his life and his exploits. I'll be speaking in New York City. There's as much going on in New York City as there is here, surprisingly. There has been interest in a marker on City Hall Plaza for where Joseph Warren's home and office was. That's been around for several years and never seems to get off the ground, but at any rate. And then I maintain a website with primary source documents of Joseph Warren's speeches. My publisher published the Lux edition in honor of the 250th anniversary. You can have a look at that back there. And the weirdest thing was there was an attempt by People's Republic of China censors to change Joseph Warren's life. And I encountered this through the back door. My publisher, like a lot of publishers, uses overseas printers to print books at lower costs than Americans can. But in so doing, I came into a conversation with Chinese communist censors in Hong Kong who wanted to change the story. My publisher had not ran into that, and he at first said, just go along with it. It's not central to the story, and they publish beautiful books. And my reaction was, what would Joseph Warren do? Well, that ended up with an American publisher from Indiana who has done a beautiful job with the book. And if you're interested afterwards, this was mind-boggling to me. This book has been published before. This is American history by an American author for Americans. Just happens to be published there. So they think they have the right, if it's just passing through their printing presses, that they could change things. I'm wondering how much of this is going on now that we don't know about. They didn't get away with it. They didn't get away with it for Joseph Warren. Panda, soft diplomacy, nothing to see. I could talk to you folks about these things separately. But at any rate, Joseph Warren is not a dead issue, apparently. We've talked a lot about him. Let's leave on some of his quotes. May our land be a land of liberty, the seat of virtue, the asylum of the oppressed, a name and a praise in the whole earth. And then we had encountered this before. This is his challenge to us. You are to decide the important issues on which rests the happiness and liberty of millions yet unborn. Act worthy of yourselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any questions from in the room? Start with the room. Yes.
Okay. With Suffolk, was it resolved? Where is that located?
The Suffolk Resolves House is in Milton. The Suffolk Convention met at two locations. That was the final one where the resolves were finalized. And it was said that Joseph Warren read the resolves for a vote on the front lawn, and it was passed there by the elective members of the several towns unanimously. And with that kind of language, it was kind of hard not to. But it's a very pugnacious document as well. And that's where it is. The Historical Society there is very proud of the house. It's open, I think, just several times a year. They have a website, and it's worth a visit.
I just shot another question. Okay, I'm not, I'm averse. Okay.
Oh, well, just so that people on Zoom can hear you. Yeah.
This you may not be able to answer. Okay, so Charlestown, big connection. So I live near where the first settlers came, so 1630, 1628,
Yes.
whatever it says, 150, I think, families. So something I've become interested in is whoever came over with John Winthrop, how many generations later were any of those who first came over had greats who fought in the Revolutionary War? Or how does one research that?
Oh, that's genealogy. I don't have specific knowledge, but I would hazard a guess that there must be some who did, because they were farming families who often stayed put, like the Warrens in Roxbury. So would have had connections there in Charlestown. And it's known that the receivers of the lanterns were Sons of Liberty resident in Charlestown who got their own horses and started their own rides. So it must be.
Well, in regards to Joseph Warren's account book, I noticed that there were single entry entries to his account book. Did he ever use double entry in his account book at all?
No, he used a day book, and this is if we have any accountants here, you'll probably know what I'm talking about. But a day book is like a sequential record of people coming in the office, as they come in, and then some notations about what the treatments are, and most importantly, what the charges are, because it is a financial notebook. And then from time to time, he would extract these chronological day books into an account book where he would pull out like your account for every time that you visited. And that would be the summary account that he would try to collect on. So it's not a double entry, but it is a way of using account books in that time. Significantly, the account book covering the Boston Tea Party timeframe is missing. And it was last seen in 1882. So under my theory that once something's recognized about 100 years later, it has a good chance of still existing somewhere. So I wouldn't be surprised if this thing shows up on the bottom of somebody's closet or in an attic. And I think the associations that Joseph Warren had during that key time would reflect in new ways on what he did at the Tea Party, which is at this point, all we know was he did something very important, and we don't know exactly what that was.
one question from Zoom, which I'm not sure you can answer, but they wanted to know, what did the censors want to change?
There are two chapters near the end of the book, which, albeit are not central to Joseph Warren's life. One of them is a historiographic one on why was Joseph Warren so famous in the 19th century. There are, there's 14 counties named after him, a lot of them down south, and cities and towns, and it's the third or fourth most common street name in Massachusetts. He was famous in the 19th century, and he fell off the radar screen. Why is that? And I discussed that, and makes an interesting topic. And then I did international comparisons of early revolutionary movements. And my point there, or my thesis was, the American Revolution in its early phases tried to be and aspired to be a revolution of representative government and laws, and to minimize violence when possible. And I made comparisons to the French Revolution, Russian Revolution, Chinese Revolution. And it was that latter one that the Chinese censors took issue with. I could tell you more in the break if anybody's interested. But it's interesting. This is an interesting history to a lot of people, surprisingly, a lot of people around the world. Yes, other question, sir.
Yeah, is there anything on Hall of the Medical School campus that was named after Joseph Warren or his descendants?
There are buildings associated with him. I don't believe there are there. Okay, please, we have the answer from the audience.
It's an old building, it faces a Star Drive. The pathology department has its offices in there. And it is called the Warren Building, and one wall as you enter it has some of the family history up there. And subsequent generations of buildings that contributed to the.
Thank you, sir. I did not know that.
Yeah.
The buildings, though, that remain,
Yeah.
there are two of particular interest, not named for Warren, but heavily associated with his history. Massachusetts Hall in the Harvard Yard is the site of his undergraduate dorm rooms. And it still stands, not his rooms, but
Did he also meet with Presidents Adams?
pardon?
Did he also meet with Presidents Adams or had associations with them? I look at the timeline there.
Yes, John Adams was a son of Liberty, relatively junior, but they did know each other. And even when John Adams was president, there was one of the first uniquely American plays. It was called The Death of Joseph Warren. It was performed in 1797. John Adams attended it. He did not like it at all. He said that the play depicted Joseph Warren as a warrior and a fighter rather than a gentleman and someone who aspired to scholarship. So they did know each other. John Quincy Adams was about 6 or 7 years old, and Joseph Warren fixed a broken finger of his, and he never forgot that.
Yes.
What did Dr. John Warren do for the next 6 years of the conflict? Did he stay in this area, or what was his role?
He was a Continental Army physician and corresponded. We have some correspondence with his fellow proteges of Joseph Warren, who kept in contact with each other during the Revolutionary War. They called themselves the Spunkers. And the Spunkers may have been a kind of a grave robbing pathology club of them as undergraduates, but that's less clear. But they did keep track of each other, and they're using, the Spunker type of references. And those associates included Dr. Townsend, who had some 19th century importance in medicine, the son of Samuel Adams, who was a physician and died of consumption in the 1780s. So there's several physicians. They kept in touch with each other. Joseph Warren, or John Warren, left the Continental Army approximately 1780 with special permission, I believe, of George Washington to attend, amongst other things, the orphan children of Joseph Warren. Joseph Warren left 4 orphan children in the care of his fiancée, Mercy Scully, but they were not married, and it was in some kind of legal gray zone. So one of the reasons for him leaving Continental Army service was to attend family matters. And he was starting his own family at that point. He married the beautiful daughter of the governor of Rhode Island, Collins.
On a related note, someone on Zoom asks, are there living descendants?
Yes, plenty. The last conversation I had a few years ago, maybe 4 times, was with an 8th generation Warren physician in direct line through John Warren and John Collins Warren. A very competent physician, doesn't like to be in the limelight, I would say, doesn't like to sit on the family laurels. But I would say in my work as a medical biographer, I could not name any family anywhere in the world in any time frame that had 8 generations, direct lineage of physicians, and at least one of his children, I believe, are going into medicine as well, making a 9th.
Other questions? Yes.
Comment if I may, I think John Warren's house survives. John Warren's house survives. I believe it's on Beacon Hill, not far from here. Joseph Warren's didn't, but I think John Warren's house.
I'll talk to you afterwards. One of them that's of interest is that the site of Joseph Warren's homestead was of interest to John Collins Warren, and the farmhouse, which I think I pictured at one point, basically was a wooden thing that fell apart in the 1840s. So John Collins Warren had a stone house built there in Roxbury on the footprint of the family homestead. And there are 2 commemorative stones in the face of that building, which was built in 1847, still exists. One of them commemorates John Warren, and the other himself, John Collins Warren, the birthplace of. But it's primarily Joseph Warren and John Warren that are commemorated in these plaques. So it's a living building. I believe it's currently in use and not a museum, but it was built by John Collins Warren as kind of like a working memorial to the Warren origins. So they never lived there in this house, but the house itself is kind of unique. It's like a memorial building to the Warrens of the 18th century. The building itself fell apart.
Only other thing I'd add is that just today, Donald Trump gave a speech at Fort Bragg, then Fort Liberty, now Fort Bragg again, to a military audience, and one of the people in the audience he identified as a descendant of Joseph Warren.
Modern,
Stand up.
interesting. Yeah, there are quite a few. I've run into folks from a matrilineal line. Joseph Warren himself had no known male direct descendants. He had 2 women who have matrilineal lines, that are direct descendants. And then the collateral line through John Warren also identified strongly with Joseph, even though it was more like, nephews kind of thing. That's John Collins Warren. So there are Warrens, and then there are other names that are legitimate descendants. So there are quite a few of them.
All right, and one last question?
Yes, sir.
I gathered he never met with George Washington because we never traveled 70 miles beyond Boston. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. In the weeks before Bunker Hill and him dying, the Massachusetts, what would you call it, delegation to the Continental Congress drew up a list of prominent Massachusetts people, recommending them to George Washington as the newly appointed general of the Continental Army to consider these locals for prominent positions. And Joseph Warren was one of them. But by the time George Washington got up here, Joseph Warren had been dead for a couple of weeks. He arrived here, I think, on July 2nd, 1775, to take over the Continental Army, which was basically an amalgam of these state militias that had been activated in the siege of Boston. Yes, but they never met. There are some advocates, there's some hardcore Joseph Warren advocates who say that if Joseph Warren lived, he would be more prominent than George Washington and would have been the president instead of George Washington. It's speculative history. I personally don't ascribe to that, but I think Warren would likely have been a significant person in George Washington's military family, perhaps like General Nathaniel Greene or Lafayette, and these younger people who were looked to George Washington as like pseudo fathers figures. So that is a plausible alternate history for Joseph Warren. Another is, though, that he was somewhat impulsive, and he may have gone out in front of some other battle and got himself killed.
With that, thank you very much.
Thank you.